5th, 1967, 7:45 a.m. Israel delivers a stunning opening blow in the Six-Day War. Within a few hours, the Israeli airstrike has devastated the Egyptian Air Force. Fighting on 3 different fronts against the combined might of 3 Arab armies, Israel would win a war in the space of just 6 days. How did this tiny nation achieve one of the most astonishing victories in the history of warfare? Eyewitness testimony, unique access to secret military plans, and weapons testing reveal the extraordinary story of how Israel won the Six-Day War. In early June 1967, tensions in the Middle East were rising. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had called on the Arab nations to destroy Israel. War seemed inevitable. Israel faced the grim prospect of a simultaneous invasion from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The combined Arab armies had a massive superiority in numbers of soldiers, tanks, and fighter aircraft.
Israel was viewed not only by themselves, but by the rest of the world as a scrappy little nation on the very edge of survival.
The general mood in the Arab world was that Israel is not that strong, it could be defeated.
Yet against most expectations, the opposite happened. In less than a week, Israel had defeated its Arab neighbors. How was such a stunning victory achieved? To understand the reasons for Israel's victory, it's necessary to go back to the early 1960s. At that time, Yoash Sedan was chief of planning in the IAF, the Israeli Air Force.
It was pretty obvious that not later than '68 they will eventually attack.
A military coalition between Egypt and Syria meant Israel would be facing battles on at least 2 fronts. It could expect attacks from Egypt through the Sinai Desert and by Syria from the Golan Heights. And it seemed possible that both Jordan and Iraq would add their weight to the Arab force.
Now, the question was, can you defend this kind of a sliver of the Mediterranean if they attack? The answer is no.
The best form of defense would be a strong offense, a preemptive strike. But such a strategy created its own problems.
The Israelis could not afford to put all of their oomph against the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Syrians at the same time. They had to concentrate. The Israelis had to concentrate their force against one enemy at a time.
To fight a war the way it wanted, Israel would need to gain air superiority. Once the Arab air forces had been dealt with, Israel could fight each of their ground forces in turn. In 1964, Sedan's team came up with an unorthodox plan.
The idea that we came to was to strike their airstrips.
These classified plans have remained secret for 40 years. They reveal how Israel would achieve air superiority. The primary objective would be to keep the Arab air forces on the ground.
By disabling the runways of the Egyptian Air Force, and then the Syrian, etc., you prevent the aircraft from taking off.
Targeting the runways would take hundreds of Arab aircraft out of the equation. The plan was good, in theory. But what were its chances of success?
We had a problem there. They had tens of runways, more than 50. We had only 206 aircraft.
The problem they faced is a scenario the Israeli Air Force trains for to this day. How could the IAF keep enough of their aircraft in the air to destroy all their targets?
NATO used to consider 3 missions per aircraft per 24 hours the maximum that can be done.
But was this really the limit of what could be achieved?
A bright staff officer in the Israeli Air Force was running some numbers one day and realized that the Israeli Air Force could turn around an aircraft after a mission in 6 to 8 minutes.
Everything would depend on how fast the ground crews could work.
They did so many exercises and drills to reload and refuel the aircraft that it took them up till 7 minutes.
If the ground crew worked to the limit, each aircraft could fly up to 5 missions in one day. But for such an operation to succeed would still involve taking an incredible risk.
The Israeli Air Force has got to commit nearly 100% of available air assets. The Israeli Air Force can conduct almost no other tasks while they are destroying the Egyptian Air Force.
Just a handful of fighters would be left behind to protect Israeli territory. A big risk, but not a reckless gamble.
If the Israeli Air Force could achieve near absolute air supremacy, enabling almost complete freedom of action by the Israeli Armed Forces, then that's a big payoff.
In the mid-1960s, Yalo Shavit was one of the leading pilots in the IAF. He would train many of the pilots who would carry out this operation.
In the squadrons, we had the photographs of most of our targets. Each pilot had to learn and remember by heart the direction of their runways, the amount of runways, the control tower, the storage of bombs, all the targets in the base.
For more than 2 years, the Israelis practiced this operation, codenamed Moked, meaning focus. Ground crews competed with each other to see who could turn around a fighter fastest. Pilots bombed dummy airbases, modeled on the layout of the real targets, and were constantly tested on their ability to memorize every detail of their mission.
They had to concentrate in one target, and they knew it by heart. You wake them up in the middle of the night. They knew what target they are going to bomb.
Preparations for war on the Arab side progressed at a different pace.
The army was always used as a tool to maintain stability in the country and against political opponents. It was not really preparing itself for any kind of serious confrontation with Israel.
Despite this less intense preparation, on Sunday, May 14, 1967, Egypt made its move. President Nasser deployed his troops in the Sinai Desert and then closed the Straits of Tiran. Israel's access to the Red Sea was cut. The Middle East was on the brink of war.
They thought this is it. This is the confrontation that we've been waiting for years.
Israel responded by mobilizing its reserve army. But by Saturday, June 3rd, still no attack had been launched, and Israeli news media was reporting that many soldiers had been sent home for the weekend.
You don't send people home like a day or two before a war. What is this? They have to, to train themselves, they have to be there. You cannot allow yourself releasing them for the weekend when you plan a war to the beginning of the week.
Was Israel dropping its guard? Or had Operation Moked been shelved? Which side would fire the first shots of war? On the morning of Monday, June 5, 1967, Israel fired the first shots in what would be the Six-Day War. Egypt was hit by a massive preemptive airstrike. Squadrons of Israeli jet fighters swooped down on Egyptian air bases.
Each one in the formation knew exactly where to aim and where the bombs should hit. And luckily enough, this 5th of June, there was no wind whatsoever. So wherever you aimed, the bombs went this way.
We had to pull the airplane up in order to gain altitude around 8,000 to 9,000 feet. And then we dived over the target and released the bombs.
The first target for Sever's Mirage fighter jet was Bir Tamata Airfield in the Sinai. Camped alongside the airfield was Essam Daraz, a captain in the Egyptian 4th Armored Division.
When I heard this strange, hard sound for jets, I wait and I get out the tent without my shoes, and I looked and it was Mirage. 2 Mirage.
The Egyptian Air Force was caught cold. In the first wave of attacks, 11 air bases were obliterated.
All the Egyptian aircraft destroyed, and no one aircraft could make takeoff because runways destroyed.
The Israeli plan of targeting runways first had worked perfectly. Unable to take off, Egyptian aircraft were sitting ducks.
I would say the success was beyond our thoughts, beyond what we expected.
How had the Egyptians been caught so unaware? Just 2 days before, the Israelis had appeared to be coming off the high state of alert.
Anyone in London can pick up the Jerusalem Post, and that means everyone in every Arab capital knows that the Israeli army is stood down and getting a little bit of swimming practice in.
Had the decision to send Israeli soldiers home for the weekend caused the Egyptians to relax their guard?
You use as much deception as you can possibly apply so that the Egyptians will be looking elsewhere when the blow comes.
Conventional military planning pointed to dawn being the ideal time for an attack.
Traditionally, this is when you start a war in order to use the sun to be in the eyes of the defending enemy. So if you attack from east to the west, you do it in the morning, so he has his sun in his eyes.
At dawn, the Egyptian Air Force would be in a high state of alert, but not for long.
You have a high dawn readiness, which is normal. Then the tension goes down, people go to breakfast, things happen, shifts are changed.
This was the time to catch them on the ground, unfueled, when they almost totally vulnerable.
But how did the Israelis know what this time would actually be?
To succeed in such an operation, you need 3 things: intelligence, intelligence, and intelligence.
Intelligence gathered on the Egyptian Air Force routine was critical.
The routine of activity was detected mainly by listening to the nets of communications between the planes and the ground.
You take the routine and you see that 7:45 is the best time to catch the enemy not organized enough against our attack.
At 7:45 a.m., virtually the entire Egyptian Air Force would be on the ground. Israel exploited this weakness.
This is the smartest decision in preparation of the 67 war.
Add to that the intense training of its pilots, and Israel was able to quickly gain the upper hand.
We knew almost everything which was going on the other side. Where was the real aircraft parking? Where were the dummies parking? Where are the munition storage? Where are the bomb storages? We knew everything.
Intelligence had revealed when and where the Egyptian Air Force was most vulnerable. But how did pilots like Yalo Shavit and Dan Sever avoid being detected by Arab early warning stations?
We needed to fly below the radar coverage. No communication, no radio, no nothing. Silence, total silence. You, the aircraft, and the ground flying like crazy.
Israeli aircraft approached Egypt flying fast and low over the Mediterranean, 500 miles per hour at an altitude of just below 100 feet.
If you are not cautious, you get very close to the water's level. And this is very, very dangerous.
There is nothing in the world beside you watching the horizon, watching the direction, and that's all. All your muscles are stressed, you are in total concentration, and you don't look around. When you do this or that, that's a mistake. You might, in a split of a second, touch the water. And once you touch the water, this was it. Down you go.
These calculated risks and elaborate deceptions paid off. The vital element of surprise had been kept intact until the very last moment. Shavit approached his target flying a Super Mystère fighter.
We are standing in front of the large air intake of the Super Mystère B-2. which this huge intake was required to suck a lot of air into the engine when you operated the afterburner. And this is the gun sight camera. No cheating anymore. This was it. Whenever you push the trigger, the camera took the picture, and this came back to the debriefings.
The recent addition of the gun sight camera meant Air Force commanders could rapidly evaluate just how successful the first wave of attacks had been. Dan Severe's pilot's logbook reveals that he would fly a further 2 missions that day. Many pilots would complete 5 by nightfall on June 5th. In less than 12 hours, the Egyptian Air Force was virtually wiped out.
It ended up losing 85% of the Egyptian Air Force, and that meant practically that you had no air cover and that all your ground troops are bare in the desert.
The Israelis are absolutely staggered by their success. They hoped they could disable the Egyptian Air Force, and at the end of the day, they had destroyed it.
On top of that, hammer blows had been dealt to the air forces of both Syria and Jordan. Israel had achieved air superiority. Their ground forces could now take center stage. The focus of operations would be the Sinai Desert, where the borders of Egypt and Israel meet. A vast expanse of difficult terrain, much of it impassable sand dunes. The Egyptians had constructed formidable defenses in the Sinai. A head-on clash would have been potentially disastrous for the Israelis. How could they find a way of overcoming both the Sinai's terrain and the Egyptian fortifications? Benny Mickelson has investigated Israel's strategy.
They have to penetrate in between their strongholds and to reach their rear and their flanks.
If the Egyptians could be struck swiftly and from an unexpected direction, then Israel could penetrate deep into enemy territory. But the Sinai Desert's soft sand dunes presented a serious obstacle for wheeled vehicles. Yet the Israelis were able to advance relatively easily. In the early 1960s, the Israelis had conducted experiments in their own desert, the Negev. This demonstration shows the kind of tests that would have taken place. Soldiers practiced driving vehicles through soft dunes. When they got bogged down, they had to learn how to get themselves out.
The problem is that because they are using wheels, the contact between the wheel and the terrain is relatively low and narrow. So you have to decrease the air into the tires in order to have more contact between the wheel and the ground.
Letting air out of the Jeep's tires gives the wheels more traction and allows the vehicle to gain enough momentum to get moving again. A simple but ingenious solution. The result was that the Israelis could advance through areas that the Egyptians least expected. But sand wasn't the only obstacle waiting for the Israelis in the Sinai. This Egyptian tank was state-of-the-art technology in 1967. It's typical of the fearsome weaponry that faced the Israelis in the Sinai Desert. Within the space of 48 hours, hundreds of these tanks would be knocked out by Israel's much smaller forces. How was such an unlikely victory achieved?
Each Israeli division that goes into the Sinai faces 2 Egyptian divisions. Behind those 2 Egyptian divisions is 1 more Egyptian reserve division. So that means the Israeli divisions are fighting with a 3-to-1 disadvantage. In any staff college in the world, they'll tell you, do not attack with less than a 3-to-1 advantage.
Overcoming such odds would mean tackling the Sinai's intimidating terrain. Tanks may appear as though they can go anywhere in any terrain, but there's a limit to the steepness of the slopes they can climb.
If the dune is more than 20 degrees on the climbing slope, so all the tanks and APCs cannot climb the dune.
The Egyptians knew that in the Sinai there were dunes that were just too steep. so they arranged their defenses on the basis that an attack would come down the few roads through the desert. Benny Michelson has discovered documents that reveal how Israel would turn this unfavorable position to their advantage.
The purpose of the terrain analysis was to find routes of advance in such a way that we can bypass and attack the enemy from the direction that is not expected.
Michelson has found a trafficability map, a map that shows exactly where vehicles could and could not travel.
The trafficability map is a final product of many years of research.
The important detail of this unique map of the Sinai is the distinctive form of color coding.
The colors are very, very simple. The white color is trafficable, the dark color is non-trafficable.
What the trafficability map reveals is that the Sinai Desert was not an insurmountable obstacle. There were a few key routes that were trafficable by military vehicles.
It's very funny to say it, but because of our deep research of years, we knew the possibility to use the ground in enemy territory better than the enemy itself.
Even knowing the best routes to attack the Egyptians, one thing was inevitable. It would all come down to a fierce tank battle in the Sinai. Tank historian David Fletcher has looked at the tanks the Israelis were basing their armored forces on in the early 1960s.
They started off pulling stuff out of scrapyards and then started buying up from used stocks from around the world where they could.
The one tank that was widely available was this late World War II model of the Sherman. Israel bought hundreds of them.
By the time the Israelis are putting these things in the field in large numbers, they are actually dealing with things like the T-54 and T-55, which effectively are the next generation of tank, with a far bigger and more effective gun.
How could the Israelis take on the Russian-built T-54 and T-55s with what was thought to be an inferior tank?
One thing the Sherman had proved during the Second World War was its adaptability. The possibility of putting an extra gun on or changing a gun, that sort of thing, was easy. And therefore, from the Israelis' point of view, it was an excellent tank to start work on.
This is an M51 Super Sherman tank with a radical Israeli makeover.
You cannot recognize the original one because we upgrade the firepower, the protection, and the mobility. We changed the caliber from the original 76mm to 105 French gun that it allowed us to hit any target on a distance of 1,000 meters without any correction.
They even modified the tracks for improved desert performance.
We increased the width and we changed the material in such a way that it improved very much the trafficability. We can see also that the protection, I mean the armor, is completely new.
With the revamped Sherman and modifications to other tanks in their armory, the Israelis calculated they could take on the Egyptians in the Sinai.
So an Israeli tank is a souped-up version of someone else's tank. It's a little bit better on the theory that if you're just a little bit better than the enemy, you're going to win.
Within 36 hours of the Israeli attack in the Sinai, the Egyptian armored divisions were ordered to pull back. Many Egyptian soldiers couldn't understand this decision.
We felt that as an army, as a professional, we did not fight because no chance to fight.
The withdrawal that took place was the worst possible you could ever imagine. If you brought a military commander and asked him to put the worst possible withdrawal plan, nothing could have been worse than this.
During the retreat across the Sinai, the Egyptians suffered thousands of casualties and lost hundreds of tanks.
The damage was beyond any imagination. We never thought that we could do this kind of damage.
These blackened, twisted lumps of metal were once a mighty Egyptian division. What kind of power could have inflicted such all-consuming destruction? There has been speculation that Israel used a terrifying weapon, napalm.
Napalm is nothing more than petrol taken into a gelled state with the addition of gelling agents to make it a bit like hair gel or grease. Okay, here we have petrol. So in its normal state, it's very, very thin liquid, forms very, very thin droplets. when there's an explosion next to it. By contrast, the napalm is much denser, and when there's an explosion next to it, it forms fairly large, dense droplets that can be thrown an awful lot further than the pure liquid and then go and adhere to the targets.
That's the theory. How do napalm and conventional gas explosives perform in practice? In this experiment, a container of gas will be detonated.
Firing in 3, 2, 1, firing.
The explosion dissipates in just a fraction of a second. Next, the sticky napalm.
Firing in 3, 2, 1, firing.
A huge plume of fire and a much greater spread of flaming material. 30 seconds after the explosion, droplets of napalm are still burning. Napalm's greater destructive potential is clear. But how would it have been used against the Egyptians in the Sinai? On Wednesday, June the 7th, Egypt's armored divisions were retreating west towards the Suez Canal. Their routes took them through 3 mountain passes.
In that state of panic, they were all trapped in the 3 passes in the Sinai and became a sitting duck for the Israeli Air Force.
Complete air superiority would mean that Yellow Shavit's squadron could strike the Egyptians at will. He can confirm that napalm bombs were used, and to devastating effect.
The napalm is a very cruel, very, very unpleasant kind of a bomb.
We saw like atom bomb, suddenly fire.
Essam Daraz was one of the Egyptian soldiers on the ground who witnessed the terrifying napalm attack.
All the sky was red color. Black and red, it is very difficult to explain.
You go over the target and then you feel the wow of the fire that came up. It's frightening even to think about it now, because the tank was caught in fire and the black smoke, like a huge chimney, sucks this smoke up into the sky. It's terrible.
Hundreds of Egyptian tanks and trucks were engulfed in an inferno. This is film of the horrific aftermath of the napalm airstrikes. It has never been screened before. Yet for the Egyptians, the nightmare of their Sinai retreat was not yet over. Wednesday, June 7th, 1967. The Six-Day War was barely 2 days old, and the Egyptian army was disintegrating in the Sinai desert. Yet even in the searing heat of early June, the Israeli advance showed no sign of letting up. How could 2 armies, both used to such conditions, perform so differently? These Israeli paratroopers are preparing for a training march in the middle of summer. It's vital they're able to keep going in the blistering heat.
The first few days that I joined the army, there was a heat wave. It's like getting boiled in an oven, especially in the desert.
Before the march starts, the platoon medic checks the conditions his soldiers are going to encounter.
When soldiers are on the march, they have to drink about between 5 to 6 liters. Before the march, they start 6 hours before, and they drink every hour 1 liter.
Strict water drinking regulations were implemented by the Israeli army in 1959. Up until that point, the need for soldiers to avoid dehydration was appreciated only by medical officers such as Ezra Sohar.
In these days, the army used to issue 1 liter of water per day per soldier.
Sohar and a team of military medics decided to conduct a unique experiment with a group of soldiers by marching the entire length of Israel in August, the hottest month of the year. Every day, they covered 17 miles, with hourly rest breaks to take on water.
We found that a person in a very hot area, if he works physically, the amount of sweat can reach up to 20 liters a day. So to make up for it, we suggested that they drink 1 liter every hour.
By the end of the march, the benefits of regular water intake were plain to see.
These soldiers, they were in excellent condition. They said, we are ready to continue indefinitely. The difference was the drinking.
After the 1959 experiment, Army water regulations were changed from 1 liter of water per soldier per day to 1 liter per hour when soldiers were on the march. Cases of heat stroke and dehydration virtually disappeared.
Napoleon said the army walks on its stomach. This is perhaps true in Europe. In the Middle East, the army walks on its water.
When war came in 1967, the Israelis knew that ensuring water supplies would be vital. This contrasted starkly with the situation in the Egyptian army.
The retreating Egyptian army did not carry much water with it. Thousands, or perhaps even 10,000s, of Egyptian soldiers died during 1967 because they lost their units and they were cut off from water supplies.
They have to walk 200 kilometers. No sleep, no food, no water, no medicine, nothing at all.
It's likely that in the Sinai, the Egyptians suffered more casualties to heat than to enemy action. By Friday, June 9th, the Egyptians had been driven back across the Suez Canal. Israel had captured Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan after 2 days of bitter fighting. Yet the Israeli and Syrian armies had still not engaged. The theater of war would now move to Israel's northeast border with Syria, the Golan Heights. This mountainous area was vitally important because it gave Syria a near-impregnable defensive position.
The Syrian exploits the nature of the Golan Heights. It's very steep, and they use the slope to build 3 lines of fortifications.
To have any chance of success against the Syrians, the Israelis needed to concentrate all their available forces.
The most important factor there was that the Israelis had already finished with both the Egyptian and the Jordanian fronts, and they had diverted all their power to the Syrian front.
This rusting, shell-splintered half-track testifies to the bloody struggle that occurred here. But by Saturday, June 10th, Israel had taken the Golan Heights. Much of that success came down to the Israelis' ability to hit concealed Syrian artillery positions. How did they know where to strike? The answer lies in the extraordinary story of Eli Cohen, Israel's most famous spy. In 1961, Cohen's brothers, Abraham and Morris, were kept in the dark about his real life.
We didn't know exactly what he is doing abroad, but we do know that Eli is doing something for the government.
Cohen was working undercover in Syria for Mossad, the Israeli secret service.
We needed desperately to have somebody to work for us there, to give us information when they will attack us.
And Cohen's upbringing in Egypt helped maintain his cover.
He was a Jew who came from an Arab country, and he knew very well Arabic.
Cohen, Agent 088, was known in Syria as Kamal Amin Tabet. He became close friends with General El Hafez, the president, and incredibly was appointed a member of the country's high command.
He was given a free hand and access to all the positions everywhere. He was even escorted by military commanders to visit positions, and he had drawn detailed plans.
So secure was his access that he was able to pose for this photograph during a visit to the Golan Heights with Syrian military officials. All the while, he was gathering valuable information for his real bosses. But Cohen's luck would soon run out. In January 1965, he was caught sending a coded transmission from his home in Damascus.
I think that this lemon was squeezed too hard. And this is why he was found.
Cohen was interrogated by Syrian intelligence, tortured, and put on public trial.
I thought that the Mossad will succeed to rescue him.
Then suddenly they said they're going to hang him.
On May 18, 1965, the Cohen family watched in horror as his execution was broadcast live on Syrian television.
We lost our world. We didn't know what to do.
But what had Cohen's espionage actually achieved? One famous story recounts that after Cohen's tour of artillery positions on the Golan, he made a strong recommendation to the Syrian High Command.
He says those guys are suffering from sunburn and heat casualties. We must do something to protect them from the sun. Nothing is too good for our boys in the field. Plant trees by every artillery emplacement. And they do. They plant trees by every Syrian artillery emplacement on the Golan Heights. And the Israelis watch these trees growing up, telling them exactly where every Syrian artillery emplacement is.
Can this story really be believed? 40 years after Cohen's death, his brothers have come to the Golan Heights in search of evidence.
It's very exciting to be here in the very spot that Eli walked here with the Syrian delegation in the border.
They found what they believe was one of the Syrian fortified positions their brother visited. This vast complex of hidden bunkers is still intact.
You see, this is another bunker. This is another one. All around the area, there is many bunkers.
You see this eucalyptus tree?
Yeah.
Perhaps Eli suggested to plant them here as a shelter from the sun here for the Syrian soldiers.
Tellingly, the Golan slopes in this area are virtually bare. But around the bunker complex today, there are many mature eucalyptus trees. This would suggest that Eli Cohen succeeded in helping the Israelis to pinpoint Syrian artillery positions.
He had sent to the Israeli military detailed plans of where the positions are and the number of troops there. And in fact, they had known almost everything about the Syrian forces in that area.
Though Cohen died 2 years before the Six-Day War, he undoubtedly influenced its outcome. Yet even with this invaluable intelligence, much more blood would be spilt before Israel had conquered the Golan Heights. This is a memorial to some of the Israeli soldiers who were killed on the unforgiving terrain of the Golan Heights. For Israel, this would be the most difficult part of the Six-Day War.
The Golan Heights are covered with big basalt boulders, big volcanic boulders. They're naturally occurring tank traps.
How did the Israelis overcome such obstacles? Intelligence had revealed exactly where the most difficult terrain lay. So a route of attack was chosen to both avoid the tank traps and surprise the Syrians.
The concept was to use such a path to penetrate in between the Syrian positions and to attack the all three lines of defense simultaneously.
Many Israeli armored vehicles advanced down this very track, but then disastrously took a wrong turning.
One battalion, the battalion of 8th Armor Brigade, lose from 26 tanks, 24 tanks. They had 13 killed in action and about 33 wounded.
After 4 days of astonishing success, the war was now proving very costly for Israel. One of the most difficult objectives was Tel Fahir Bunker, a bewildering complex of concrete-covered trenches, bristling with heavily armed Syrian soldiers determined to hold out. How did the Israelis manage to take such a strong defensive position? A particular kind of weapon would come to the fore.
The submachine gun was one of the all-round useful weapons of the Second World War. It provides a lot of firepower in close quarters, and sometimes that's just what you need.
So impressed were the Israelis with this weapon that they invented their own version, the Uzi 9mm. In the Tel Fahir bunker, this submachine gun would come up against the legendary Kalashnikov, the AK-47.
Both of them will fire around about 600 rounds a minute, which is 10 a second. Both of them will hold anything between 20 to 30 rounds.
How do these weapons compare in an accuracy test? McIntyre is firing at a target 50 meters away. 5 shots from each gun. All the rounds hit the target, but only the AK-47 gets close to the center of the black.
The AK has the advantage that you can hit the target at a much longer range, and the ballistics are still lethal at those ranges. The 9mm really falls short of that and wouldn't be lethal at anything more than 100 meters.
But in the close-up fight at Tel Fahir bunker, long-range accuracy was not the deciding factor. It was smooth handling in a tight space that was more important. So how do these two weapons compare in a trench combat test? First, the Uzi. It's easy to use and quick to reload. Then the AK-47. It's powerful but slower to bring to bear than the Uzi, and reloading is not the same smooth process. In this test, it even jams.
The Uzi is much better in confined spaces, much more pointable. This is much more like a traditional rifle. The AK requires a much kind of longer physical stance, whereas the Uzi can be used much easier close into the body. The ergonomics of the Uzi are much better. It has this design where hand naturally finds hand in case of a magazine change. That process is a lot more complicated on the AK because there is a lever here, just to be pushed forwards. The magazine then has to come out. It's a very awkward action. It's far less intuitive to change the magazine on this than it would on the Uzi.
It's a small weapon, it's a handy weapon. In the close quarters of a trench, when turning around with some great big long accurate rifle is not an option, Uzi's a nice little fella to have with you.
Inside the Tel Fahir bunker, and many others like it on the Golan, the Uzi could have been the factor that gave the Israelis the edge. By the morning of Saturday, June 10th, the Syrians had been finally driven from their bunkers on the Golan Heights and were retreating to Damascus. The 6-day war was over. In less than a week, Israel had defeated first Egypt, then Jordan, and finally Syria. But was this really Israel's brilliant military triumph? Or were critical mistakes by the Arab countries decisive?
They didn't succeed to concentrate their forces all together against Israel. We fought each one alone. They couldn't make a real coalition and attack us all together.
Though the Arab countries failed to combine their forces effectively, many soldiers in the Egyptian army believe to this day that they were not given the chance to do themselves justice in battle.
They lost the war, but they not defeated because they felt we did not fight, because no chance to fight.
But this was an historic victory for Israel.
Never in the history of the wars of Israel so many people achieved such a huge victory in such a short time.
We had a plan. It was worked in detail. It was properly trained for, and it was superbly carried out with a lot of luck. With a lot of luck.
Years of training, planning, and intelligence gathering meant that Israel was able to minimize factors that were left to chance.
The decisive factor was executing the plan to the letter, based on strictly military measures, nothing to do with politics, and do not let politicians intervene.
There was an Egyptian officer who said early in the war, the Israelis prepared for this war, we prepared for parades through the streets of Cairo.
In 1967, Israel was ready.